This is not just a story of forbidden love. It is the story of chains, blood, and vengeance. The voice of the narrator cuts through silence like a blade, setting the stage for what follows. On the plantations of the American South, life for the enslaved was measured not in years, but in scars, each day carved into flesh by the cruelty of overseers and the hunger that gnawed at their bones. In the fields, men and women bent beneath the lash, their backs glistening with sweat and blood, their cries swallowed by the endless rhythm of the whip. The master's house stood tall, painted white, but beneath its polish was rot, rooms where cruelty festered, and a family that thrived on the suffering of others. The air itself seemed heavy, as though it carried the weight of grief, as though the soil remembered the footsteps of those stolen from Africa, dragged in chains across the sea. In the night, when the work was done, voices whispered in the darkness. Songs that mourned, songs that prayed, songs that kept alive the faintest flicker of hope. Yet hope was dangerous. It was a spark the master feared, because a single spark could become fire, and fire could consume. This story belongs to one who lived beneath that whip, a man whose scars were maps of survival and whose silence hid a storm. His life was built on cruelty, his body broken and patched together by endurance, his spirit battered yet unbowed. And within the very house of his tormentor, he found something forbidden. Love, fragile yet burning. The kind of love that the master could never chain, never silence. But do not mistake this tale for a romance. It is a reckoning. It is the cry of the enslaved against the empire of cruelty that tried to erase them. It is the story of one man who chose vengeance over silence, fire over fear. He dared to love where he was told only to suffer. He dared to fight where he was told only to kneel. If you hear his cry, if you feel his fire, share this story. Let the world know what chains tried to bury. For every scar, every lash, every tear, this story answers with blood and with truth. This is his vengeance. This is his legend. The plantations spread wide across the land, a kingdom of misery carved out of swamp and cane. The fields seemed endless, stretching toward the horizon where the sun rose only to scorch the backs of those forced to labor beneath it. The swamp water shimmered with insects, the air thick with the stench of mud and sweat, and the cries of birds circling overhead felt like mockery. At the center of it all stood the master's big house, painted white, but looming like a fortress, its windows watching the enslaved like unblinking eyes. To those who worked the fields, it was not a home but a tower of command, where cruelty was born and sent down like thunder. Among the hundreds who toiled in those fields was Elijah, a man young in years but aged in suffering. His skin was dark, his back a tapestry of scars, each mark etched by a whip wielded with practiced hatred. He rose before dawn each day, chains rattling faintly at his ankles as he trudged to the cane fields, a crude hoe pressed into his hands. The overseer's voice was the morning bell, shouting curses, promising lashes if a man dared to falter, if a woman dared to slow her pace. Every stalk of cane cut was a heartbeat stolen, every drop of sweat another reminder that he was property, not human in the master's eyes. For Elijah, silence was survival. The whip sang across his skin like fire, and silence was the only answer he was allowed. To cry out was weakness, to protest was rebellion, to stand tall was defiance. And yet within him, defiance lived all the same. The master, a man whose wealth had been built on chains, took pleasure in cruelty. He burned his initials into Elijah's back once, pressing a heated iron into his skin as though branding livestock. Elijah remembered the searing pain, the way his flesh bubbled and smoked, the way the overseers laughed as he fell to his knees. The master mocked him, saying he now belonged not only in chains, but in flesh, his body carrying the mark of ownership. Even as Elijah clenched his jaw, even as tears cut trails through the dirt on his cheeks, he swore within himself that no man could own the fire inside him. But cruelty did not end with the lash or the iron. Elijah's family, the only blood he had to anchor him, was ripped from him piece by piece. His mother sold to another plantation when he was barely old enough to understand, her face fading into memory with every mile that carried her away. His younger brother, a boy with laughter too loud for the master's liking, was hanged in front of the quarters as punishment for taking an extra piece of bread. Elijah's wife was taken one night and never seen again, traded like cattle for debts the master owed. Each loss hollowed him, but each hollow filled with a deeper hatred, a hatred that waited. The days passed in unbearable heat. His body bent until his bones ached, His stomach gnawed empty from rations too meager to keep strength. The overseers carried whips coiled at their sides like serpents, striking without hesitation. A stumble, a pause to wipe sweat, even the glance of an eye that lingered too long on freedom's horizon. All could earn a lash. Sometimes Elijah would lie awake in the shack he shared with others, listening to the moans of the beaten, the coughing of the sick, the quiet weeping of those who had lost everything. In those nights, he would stare at the slats of wood above him and feel the weight of chains pressing down, even as his hands were free in sleep. The master reveled in breaking men. He mocked Elijah during punishments, laughing as he collapsed in dirt, daring him to rise again. "You'll never be more than this," he sneered, his boots pressing Elijah's face into the ground. But Elijah did rise again and again. His silence was not surrender. It was the patience of a storm. He endured, scar after scar, day after day, his hatred smouldering deep, waiting for the moment it would be unleashed. In the fields he bent, cut and carried. In the big house he served, his eyes lowered though his mind roared. The plantation was a machine built to crush, to grind humanity into dust. But Elijah was no dust. He was iron, bent but not broken, scarred but not silenced. And though the world around him sought to erase his very being, inside him, a fire burned that no whip could extinguish. The fields might have owned his body. The master might have scarred his back. But Elijah's soul was sharpening itself, preparing for the day when silence would end, and vengeance would speak in his place. She was the daughter of the master, born in the house that towered over the fields like a monument to cruelty. Her skin was pale, her hands untouched by labor, her dresses clean while the people outside bent in rags beneath the sun. Yet for all the privilege that wrapped around her like silk, there was something restless in her eyes, something that did not quite belong to the house she lived in. She walked through halls polished by suffering, sat at tables heavy with food bought by the sweat of enslaved backs, and still she felt the cracks beneath it all. Her name was Anna. To her father, she was a treasure, a symbol of the bloodline he boasted of. To the enslaved, she was untouchable, a figure glimpsed in windows or passing through the yard. To Elijah, she was danger itself, and yet she became something more. Their first encounter was nothing but a glance, yet it carried a weight he could not shake. He was carrying buckets of water to the kitchen when she passed. Her eyes lingered on him, not in the way her father's guests did, not as if she were measuring his body like property, but as if she saw the human inside the chains. It startled him, that look. It was brief, almost hidden, but it planted something he did not dare name. It grew in small acts. Once, after a long day in the fields, Elijah returned to the yard, lips cracked with thirst, body trembling from the lash. She appeared quietly near the well, her steps light, her gaze cautious. Without a word, she offered him a cup of water. He hesitated, knowing the danger. If anyone saw, it could mean blood for both of them. But her hand did not waver. He took it, drank, and for the first time in years, water tasted like something more than survival. It tasted like mercy. There were other moments, bread left where only he might find it, a whisper when no one else was near. "You don't deserve this." At night, when the house lamps dimmed and voices faded, he sometimes caught her watching from the balcony as the enslaved filed back to their shacks. Their eyes met across the darkness, two lives chained by the same cruel man but bound in different ways. She was his daughter, but even she lived beneath his shadow, silenced by his fury. Anna was not blind to her father's cruelty. She had seen him beat Elijah until he collapsed, had watched him tear families apart without a thought. She had cried in secret, hiding her shame behind locked doors. Rebellion flickered in her heart, though she had no weapon with which to wield it. And yet, by offering a kindness where cruelty was expected, she was rebelling all the same. Elijah knew the risk. Every look, every stolen word, every kindness exchanged was a step closer to death. He told himself to turn away, to bury it, to keep silent. But silence had been his life, and in her presence, silence cracked. When she looked at him, he was not just property, he was a man, and it stirred something within him that chains had not killed. There was a night when rain poured over the plantation, drumming against the roofs of shacks and the walls of the big house. Elijah was ordered to haul supplies from the barn, his body aching from the day's toil. She found him there, her dress damp from the storm, her voice trembling as she whispered his name. His hands froze, the sound of his name from her lips like something forbidden, something holy. He turned, and for a long moment they only stared at each other. The storm roared outside, but between them, there was a silence that carried more power than thunder. Love sprouted like weeds between stones of hate. It grew in the cracks of cruelty, in the shadows where no one dared look. Neither asked for it, neither planned for it, and yet it rooted itself deep, unstoppable, dangerous. They both knew discovery meant death, but the more they tried to turn away, the stronger it grew, until the thought of silence seemed heavier than the thought of risk. What they shared was not born of freedom or peace. It was born of defiance, the refusal to let cruelty dictate the boundaries of their hearts. And in that defiance, a new fire began to burn, one that would soon consume everything in its path. The nights on the plantation were heavy with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of the cane fields in the wind and the distant barking of dogs. Elijah would lie on the hard wooden boards of the shack, staring into the dark, listening to the breathing of men too weary to dream. But within him, the silence had begun to change. Where once it had been the stillness of resignation, now it became the waiting hush of a storm not yet broken. He began to imagine life beyond the fences, beyond the swamp, and the reach of the overseer's whip. He saw flashes in his mind, a road stretching into freedom, a place where no one called him property, a world where his name belonged only to himself. During the day, he bent his back to the fields, but his eyes studied everything. The movements of the patrols, the times the overseer grew lax, the way shadows fell around the big house at night. He noticed which dogs were chained, which gates were weakest, which paths through the swamp disappeared into mist. The master's cruelty had trained him in silence, but his silence was no longer submission. It was planning. Others around him seemed broken. Some had lost their will, their spirits crushed after years of torment. Elijah understood their exhaustion, but he would not let it claim him. He swore to himself that he would not die in chains, that his bones would not rot in the soil of a plantation that thrived on his suffering. He had lost too much. His family sold away, his brother's laughter silenced by a rope, his back scarred by fire. The master had taken everything but his rage, and rage was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. In those secret moments with Anna, the master's daughter, his dreams of freedom grew sharper, more vivid. What began as kindness between them became something far more dangerous: trust. She would slip into the barn or the kitchen late at night, when others slept, her footsteps light, her eyes always darting to the shadows. She brought scraps of food, pieces of cloth, and most of all, words. She whispered to him of cities she had only heard of, places far north where chains were broken, where black men walked free, where laws did not permit the whip and the auction block. There are places, she told him softly as she pressed cloth against his torn back, where men like you are not slaves, where you can choose who you are. Her words were more than comfort, they were fuel. When her fingers brushed against his wounds, when her voice promised a world beyond the horizon, something unshackled in him. He began to see not just survival, but escape. Not just escape, but defiance. And not just defiance, but vengeance. They met when they could, always in silence, always at risk. She would press bread into his hand, and he would take it, their eyes meeting in that dangerous stillness. She became more than his forbidden lover. She became his co-conspirator, his only ally in a world built to crush him. Together they spoke in half-whispers, never daring to say too much, but enough to know that the day would come when silence would end. Elijah's dreams grew darker, sharper. He no longer imagined slipping quietly away into the night. He imagined fire in the cane fields, blood on the white walls of the big house. He imagined the master's cruelty answered with screams of his own. Each lash that tore across his back was another debt to be repaid. Each scar was a vow, and though neither Elijah nor Anna spoke it aloud, both knew what their bond meant. It was not just love. It was not just rebellion. It was the spark in the dry grass, the whisper before the shout, the silence before the storm. Their secret was more than dangerous. It was destined to ignite, and when it did, blood would follow. The day began like so many others, with the crack of the overseer's voice splitting the morning air, and the enslaved filing into the fields. The sun rose mercilessly, heavy on their backs. But it was not the heat that made the day unforgettable. It was the cruelty that followed. Elijah had worked without pause, his muscles straining against exhaustion, but a single slip of his blade against the cane was enough to draw the overseer's attention. The man seized on it with glee, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. With a shout, he dragged Elijah forward, his grip iron around his arm, pulling him toward the yard where punishment was delivered. The other enslaved were forced to gather, their tools abandoned, their bodies trembling with the knowledge of what was to come. The master appeared from the steps of the big house, his boots clicking against the wood, his eyes glinting with the cruel satisfaction of a man who knew he owned the flesh and futures of all who stood before him. He gestured lazily for the overseer to begin, his lips curling in a smile that carried no warmth. Elijah was thrown to his knees in the dirt, his shirt ripped from his back, and the whip was brought out, a long, coiled serpent that hissed as it was unfurled. The first lash tore across his skin like fire, slicing open scars that had never healed. The second carved deeper, blood trickling down his spine. The overseers laughed as he bled, their voices sharp and mocking, delighting in his pain. Each strike was punctuated by jeers. Each cut of leather across his flesh meant not only to punish but to humiliate. The master watched with satisfaction, his arms folded, his head tilting, as though admiring a piece of work being perfected. And then, from the corner of his eye, Elijah saw her, Anna, standing at the edge of the porch, her face pale, her hands trembling. She did not cry out, did not move, for she knew any sound from her would bring her father's fury down upon her. But her eyes brimmed with silent tears. Her lips pressed together to hold back the sobs. Elijah saw her anguish, and though his body shook under the weight of pain, it was her silent grief that sharpened his resolve. This cruelty could not stand. This man who called himself master, who took lives as if they were coin, who mocked pain as if it were sport, his reign would end. As the whip cracked again and again, Elijah's mind carried him into memory. He saw his mother, her face wet with tears as she was dragged from the plantation, sold away to another master. He remembered his younger brother, no more than a boy, his laughter silenced by a rope when he was caught stealing food. He saw his wife, taken in the night, her screams echoing until they were swallowed by distance. He felt the burn of the irons seared into his back, branding him like an animal, the smell of his own flesh rising into the air while men laughed. Every cruelty returned to him in that moment, each memory pressing down like a weight he could not bear. And yet, instead of crushing him, it forged him harder, stronger. Blood pooled in the dirt beneath him, the overseer's laughter mingling with the crack of leather. But Elijah's silence held. He would not scream. He would not give them the satisfaction of his voice. He lifted his head once, meeting the master's gaze. What the master saw there was not submission, but defiance, a glimmer of fire that even the lash could not extinguish. The master sneered, amused by what he mistook for foolish pride. But Elijah knew it was more. It was promise. The narrator's voice carries through the scene, solemn and steady. Every scar was a tally, every whip a debt he would repay. When at last they cast him aside, his back torn and raw, he lay in the dirt gasping for breath. The enslaved turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight, yet afraid to look too long. Anna had vanished into the shadows of the house, her tears hidden, but Elijah carried the memory of her sorrow with him as surely as he carried the pain carved into his back. That night, as he lay on the rough boards of his shack, staring at the darkness above, his vow was sealed. The cruelty of that day would not fade into silence. It would return, sharpened, multiplied. It would answer the whip with blood, the jeers with screams, the master's laughter with his final silence. The storm broke over the plantation like an omen, thunder shaking the windows of the big house, rain slashing through the cane fields in wild sheets. The enslaved huddled in their shacks, the overseers cursed as their torches sputtered in the wind, and the world seemed to vanish into darkness. It was in this chaos, when the master's grip loosened for a moment, that Elijah found himself in the barn, his body still raw from the whip, his soul burning hotter than the storm outside. She came to him then, her dress clinging to her skin from the rain, her hair plastered to her cheeks. Anna's eyes were wide, frightened yet determined, carrying the weight of a decision that could not be undone. She whispered his name as though it were the only thing in the world that mattered, the sound nearly drowned by thunder. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air thick with fear and something else, something dangerous that had been growing between them for months, something no chains could stop. Elijah tried to speak, to tell her she should not be here, that the risk was too great. But the words caught in his throat. The storm outside seemed to press them closer, the barn walls trembling, the shadows swaying in the flicker of lantern light. She reached for him, her hands trembling as they touched his chest, sliding over scars she had bandaged in secret. Her touch was not gentle this time. It was desperate, clinging, as though she feared he might vanish if she let go. What happened then was not romance. It was survival. It was rebellion. It was two souls stripped raw by the cruelty of the world, finding in each other a spark that refused to die. They clung to one another in the darkness, their breaths ragged, their bodies meeting not in tenderness but in defiance. Outside, the storm howled, lightning splitting the sky, but inside the barn, another storm raged. A storm of human need, of forbidden fire that no master could command. Afterward, she lay against him, her fingers tracing the ridges of the scars across his back. "I'll go with you," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of it. "Wherever you go, I'll follow. I won't stay here. I won't live under him any longer." Elijah turned to her, his eyes searching hers, seeing not pity but resolve. She was the master's daughter, born into privilege, yet in that moment she bound her fate to his. He told her of the swamps, of the roads beyond, of the freedom whispered about in secret songs. She listened, nodding, pressing his hand to her chest as if sealing an oath. Together they began to plan the time, the place, the path they would take. She spoke of keys she could steal, of doors she could unlock, of moments when her father's guard was weakest. Each word was dangerous, each promise a step toward death, yet neither flinched. But Elijah knew what she did not. He knew that escape was never clean, never bloodless. The master would not let go of him without a fight. The overseers would not allow silence to cover their failure. Blood would be spilled, and Elijah was ready. The storm outside seemed to echo his thoughts, lightning tearing the sky as if to mark the coming reckoning. He kissed her forehead, his voice low and steady. "We'll run," he said. "But first, there must be fire." And in the shadows of that barn, with the storm as witness, their love became more than defiance. It became a vow sealed in desperation, a promise forged in the heat of rebellion. The night was forbidden, their bond forbidden, but from it came the spark that would set the plantation aflame. The night began in silence, the kind of silence that trembles with expectation. The storm had passed, leaving the plantation heavy with damp air and the faint hiss of rain dripping from the roofs. The enslaved had been locked into their shacks, overseers dozing with whiskey in their bellies, the master sitting at his table with a smug sense of power that had never been challenged. But Elijah was awake. His body ached with scars, his hands shook with rage, and in his palm he clutched a blade stolen from the tool shed. Small, rusted, but sharp enough to cut through flesh. His heart pounded, not with fear but with purpose. Tonight would be the reckoning. He moved like a shadow across the yard, every step silent, every breath measured. The overseer nearest the barn sat slumped on a stool, a lantern at his side, the whip coiled on his belt. Elijah approached with the patience of a hunter. The overseer stirred, half opening his eyes, but before sound could leave his mouth, Elijah struck. The blade slid across his throat in one swift motion. Blood sprayed across the dirt, the overseer's hands clawing at his neck, eyes wide with disbelief before life left them. Elijah lowered his body to the ground, the lantern flickering, as though bowing to the first death of the night. Inside the house, Anna waited. She had stolen keys from her father's chamber, her hands trembling as she unlocked the servant's door. When Elijah slipped inside, their eyes met, his burning with fire, hers heavy with fear, yet resolute. She whispered directions. Which doors were locked, where the guards slept, how to reach the dining hall where the master sat with his wine. Together they moved through the mansion, shadows among shadows, their footsteps muffled by rugs stained with the wealth of suffering. The master sat at the head of his long table, candles burning bright, a feast spread before him. He was alone, drunk and satisfied, the remains of roasted meat and rich bread before him, as though the suffering of others tasted sweet on his tongue. Elijah stepped into the doorway, blade in hand, his body trembling not with hesitation, but with the storm of years contained within him. The master looked up, confusion flashing across his face before it twisted into cruel laughter. "You dare?" he mocked, rising unsteadily. "You think you can touch me?" Elijah did not answer with words. He moved forward, faster than the master could retreat, and with all the strength of his rage, he drove the blade into the man's chest. The master gasped, clutching at Elijah's arm, but Elijah's fury was unstoppable. He wrenched the blade free and struck again and again, until the master staggered backward, blood soaking his fine clothes. With a roar that shook the hall, Elijah seized a heavy candlestick from the table and brought it down upon the master's skull. The crack echoed like thunder. The master collapsed onto the white tablecloth, his blood spilling across it, staining it red. The food, the wine, the very symbols of his power were drowned in his own lifeblood. Silence followed for a moment, as though the world itself paused to acknowledge that the tyrant had fallen. Anna stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes shining with something fierce. Relief, terror, and a strange exhilaration. She moved quickly, locking the doors behind them, guiding Elijah toward the rooms where the overseers slept. By then the noise had drawn others. Whispers spread through the quarters, and men and women stepped into the night, carrying whatever they could find: axes, knives, even stones. They saw Elijah, his blade dripping, his clothes streaked with blood, and they knew the time had come. Their silence broke into a roar. The overseers were dragged from their beds, their shouts cut off by the blows of furious hands. Chains were turned into weapons, whips torn from their belts and used against them. The enslaved, beaten and broken for years, rose together in a storm of vengeance. Screams filled the night, mingling with the crackle of torches as the big house began to burn. The air was alive with the heat of rebellion, with the sound of chains snapping as doors were kicked open, with the rhythm of feet pounding against the earth. Inside the house, blood painted the walls. Elijah moved like a man possessed, cutting down any who dared to stand in his path. Anna followed, her hands shaking as she unlocked rooms, as she guided him through corridors, as she handed him whatever weapon she could find. When one overseer lunged toward her, she snatched a knife from the table and drove it into his chest, her cry piercing the air. She had chosen her side, and there was no turning back. The dining hall was chaos. Tables overturned, candles extinguished, the master's body lying sprawled across the feast he had once presided over with arrogance. Blood stained the tablecloth, the floor, the very walls that had once witnessed laughter at the expense of suffering. Now they bore witness to justice. Outside, the enslaved danced in fury, their torches lighting the night as the mansion burned. Shadows flickered across their faces, chains breaking beneath hammers, voices rising in cries of triumph and rage. Some shouted Elijah's name, others sang fragments of old songs, their voices carrying into the darkness like a battle hymn. The night of rebellion belonged to them, no longer silent, no longer broken. They became the storm the master had always feared. Elijah stood in the center of it, his chest heaving, his blade dripping, Anna at his side. Around them the world burned, and in the flames, the enslaved saw not only destruction, but possibility. The narrator's voice carries like an echo from the depths of history. Rage had spoken, screams had been answered, and silence had finally been broken. On that night, vengeance walked the halls of the master's house, and it left behind only blood. The fire from the burning mansion lit the night sky as Elijah and Anna slipped into the darkness, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. Shouts erupted behind them, the overseers who still lived calling for hounds, for riders, for vengeance of their own. The swamp lay ahead, black water glistening under a pale sliver of moon, the only refuge they could hope for. With every step, the mud sucked at their feet, and with every breath, the weight of pursuit pressed closer. Yet Elijah pressed on, gripping Anna's hand tight, his heart hammering not only from fear but from a new, desperate freedom. The sound of dogs split the night, their barks echoing through the trees. Riders followed, their torches glowing like fiery eyes in the distance, weaving through the cane fields, searching for the fugitives who had left blood on the master's floor. Elijah urged Anna forward, whispering to keep low, to move fast, to let the swamp swallow them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, insects buzzing around them, the water rising higher with each step until it reached their waists. Yet the swamp, treacherous and unforgiving, offered cover that the open fields could not. Behind them, the hounds grew louder. Elijah heard the splashes of riders entering the marsh, the curses as horses stumbled in the mud. His breath came ragged, his muscles screaming, but his resolve burned hotter than ever. Every step was hunted, but every breath was freer than the last. The first of their pursuers came crashing through the reeds, a torch raised high. Elijah lunged, dragging the man into the water. They grappled, the torch extinguished as it sank beneath the surface. Mud filled Elijah's mouth as he forced the man under, his fingers clawing against his throat until the thrashing stopped. When he rose again, gasping, the body floated behind him, The swamp claiming another corpse. Anna had stumbled to the bank, her dress heavy with water, her eyes wide with terror. But when another rider leapt down and lunged toward her, she did not scream. Instead, she seized a jagged branch from the ground and drove it into his chest with all the strength her fear could muster. His cry cut through the night, and then he fell silent, his body crumpling at her feet. She stood frozen, her breath shaking, staring at the blood on her hands. Elijah rushed to her, gripping her shoulders, his voice low. "You did what you had to. Now you're one of us." Her eyes met his, and in that moment, her fate bound itself to his forever. The swamp became their battlefield. More men tried to follow, their torches sputtering as the water dragged them down. Elijah struck where he could, pulling riders from their saddles, slamming them into the muck until the swamp swallowed them whole. The cries of the hounds turned frantic as some drowned, tangled in the reeds, their howls silenced one by one. Anna moved beside him, no longer trembling, her face hard with resolve. She no longer looked like the master's daughter. She looked like a woman remade by blood and fire. The night stretched on, the swamp seeming endless, each step a battle against mud and water, each breath stolen from fear itself. Yet they pressed forward, leaving bodies behind them, leaving the cries of their hunters fading into the distance. Their hands remained clasped, their hearts pounding in unison. Two souls bound by love, vengeance, and survival. The narrator's voice cuts through, steady and solemn. Hunted though they were, every step carried them further from chains, further from silence, further from the house of cruelty. Every step was hunted, but every breath was freer than the last. And with each life they took, each corpse left behind in the swamp, their path forward was written in blood. The news spread faster than the riders who carried torches through the night. By dawn, before the ashes of the big house had cooled, whispers were already moving across the quarters, from shack to shack, from field to field. The master's daughter ran with him. He left death in his footsteps. The words carried like wind, slipping past lips in hushed voices, growing with every retelling until they became something more than rumor. They became a legend. The enslaved who had witnessed the slaughter spoke of Elijah's blade cutting through flesh, of the master's blood soaking into the white tablecloth where he had once feasted. They told of Anna, pale as moonlight, standing at his side, unlocking doors, guiding him through the mansion her father had ruled. They spoke of the overseers dragged screaming into the mud, of dogs silenced beneath the swamp's black water, of bodies left behind like offerings to vengeance. Each detail changed as the story passed from one mouth to another, but the heart of it never shifted. Elijah had risen, and in his rising, he had struck a blow for them all. In the fields, men bent over cane stalks hummed songs that had never existed before. The words slipped softly between the cracks of the overseer's ears, hidden in rhythm and rhyme. The lover who broke chains with blood. They sang under their breath, their voices too low to punish but too strong to silence. The women whispered his name in the hush of the night, their prayers no longer only for survival, but for courage like his. Children, too young to understand chains, listened with wide eyes as their mothers spoke of a man who would not bow, who turned scars into weapons and silence into fire. The story grew beyond the plantation. It travelled with the enslaved who were sold downriver, carried by broken voices that remembered freedom in fragments. It crossed swamps and rivers, following the secret routes of those who fled in the night, reaching distant camps where runaways gathered. Some said Elijah had been seen in the north, walking free in a city where no whip cracked. Others swore he had never left the swamp, that he had become part of it, a spirit who haunted the waters, dragging down any man who dared to hunt another soul. There were whispers that he was immortal, that he would rise whenever cruelty grew too heavy, that the sound of dogs in the night was not fear, but warning. Elijah was near. The truth was swallowed in shadow, as all legends are. Whether he lived or died mattered less than the fire he left behind. His act of vengeance was a spark that spread, impossible to cage. It did not matter if his footsteps carried him north to freedom or if the swamp claimed his body. What mattered was that he had risen, and in his rising, he had proved that even the master's house could fall. The narrator's voice lingers like the toll of a bell, slow and haunting. Even if his body was swallowed, his vengeance thundered louder than chains. His silence had ended, and in its place came a roar that echoed across generations. For every scar carved into his flesh, for every family torn from his arms, for every lash that split his skin, he had answered. He had become more than a man. He had become the story that no master could bury. And so, around fires and in fields, in songs hidden inside prayer and in whispers that passed from ear to ear, his legend endured. Elijah, the lover who broke chains with blood, the man who carried vengeance in his scars, the name that rose like thunder whenever silence threatened to return. He was gone, perhaps, but in the hearts of those who remembered, he would never vanish. This was not only a story of love, but of fury, the kind born from centuries of cruelty, the kind that could not be silenced by whips or chains. Elijah's life was carved by pain, every scar a mark of survival, every lash a memory that could not be erased. Yet he was not broken. In the heart of a world built on bondage, he rose, and in his rising he struck against everything that had sought to bury him. His story is not just his own. It belongs to all who were enslaved, to all whose voices were taken, to all who carried fire in silence until the day it could burn free. Slavery was an empire of cruelty. It was built on torn families, on backs bent beneath the sun, on bodies branded like cattle, on the cries of children ripped from their mothers' arms. It thrived on silence, on the forced stillness of men and women who were told they were not human, who were told they were property. But silence was never truly silence. Beneath it was always a hum, a low thunder of resistance, waiting, and Elijah became that thunder. He was one man, scarred and scarred again, yet within him lived the defiance of generations. His vengeance was not just his own, it was theirs too. He loved in a world that told him love was forbidden. He fought in a world that told him fighting was death. He struck back in a world that promised chains forever. And by doing so, he shattered the illusion of his master's power. The man who thought himself untouchable died with his blood staining the same table where he once feasted, his laughter silenced by the very hands he believed he owned. Elijah proved that cruelty was not eternal, that power built on suffering could bleed like any man. The enslaved remembered. They whispered his name in fields, in shacks, in hush arbors where they gathered to pray and sing. They turned his story into a song, into a warning, into a promise. The lover who broke chains with blood, they called him, because his love and his fury were bound together, each feeding the other. He left death in his footsteps, but behind that death came hope, the knowledge that masters could fall, that whips could be broken, that fire could spread from one heart to many. If his fire touched you, speak his name. Share his story, so the world remembers the man who rose from chains with a lover at his side and vengeance in his heart. Do not let his silence return. Do not let his scars be forgotten. Tell his story until the soil itself remembers, until the air carries his cry, until the world knows that chains may hold a body, but they cannot hold a soul set on fire. Every chain leaves an echo, his echoed in blood, in love, in freedom. And though the swamp may have swallowed his body, though the years may have buried his face, his echo still rolls across time, a storm that cannot be stilled. Listen closely, and you will hear it. The sound of vengeance, the sound of courage, the sound of one man who refused to die in silence. His story lives because his echo lives, and his echo will never fade.